Good morning, church. It's great to be here in the house of God as we are continuing our month of Family Ministry Month. So this morning I entitled my sermon, The Battle for Our Children. And there is a battle going on for our children. I started with the children's story. Now I'm going to continue talking to the parents and future parents and grandparents, the battle that Satan is raging against our children. On the cover of the book, Transforming Children into Spiritual Giants by George Barna, there is a sobering question. And the author asked this question: the enemy has plans for your children, do you? Very pointed question. The enemy has plans for your children, do you have plans for your children? So do we as parents and church adults have plans for our children as well? You know, many movements in history understood the importance of the children. They understood how important it is to get them when they're young. Look at the communism. I was just telling you about the children's story. The communists saw the importance of indoctrinating children from their earliest age with their propaganda ideologies. And we grew up in that society. I know how it was. They had to drill those ideas into your brain day in and day out because they understood at this age, that's when you set the foundation. Look at the Jesuits. Jesuits understood the importance of children, and when the Counter-Reformation started with the focus on children. You might have heard this. One of their leaders made the well-known statement, "Give me a child until he's what? 7 years old. And you can do what you like with him after that." The philosophy behind all of those movements is get them when they're young and we will have them for the rest of their lives. Get them when they're young and we'll have them for the rest of their lives. Unfortunately, the church is a little bit behind on that. Unfortunately, the parents, our parents in our churches, don't get this point very, very well. If the children are so important to the enemy, shouldn't they be important to us as well? There is a battle for our children, and it seems sometimes that the parents and the church, they don't want to fight that battle. It seems sometimes that we are okay with giving up control of our children to the enemy. Dan Brewster says that the parents and the church are committing the worst strategic mistake when we ignore our children. Childhood, he says, is the most formative and therefore the most strategic stage of life. He says children are like clay. Have you ever worked with clay? What can you do with clay? A lot of different things. You can form it any way you want it, in different shapes. That's what the children are. At this age, young age, they're formative. They are the most strategic stage of life because the clay is still soft. When it hardens, you can't really do much with that clay anymore. And he continues, he says, to ignore children as if they don't exist is at best a strategic mistake and at worst an invitation for the evil around us to ruin them. So as you can see, Satan has a strategy. He has a very, very good strategy that he's employing. The Great Commission tells us that we what? We need to go preach the gospel into all the nations and make disciples of all people, right? And this is the Great Commission. Satan wants to stop that. He wants to stop everyone from hearing the gospel of Jesus Christ. So what does he do? Now he has the strategy. He realized that the home is the open territory for him to go to work. He has to get them when they're young, and he will stop the gospel from spreading. If he understood, he has been at work to take Christ and Christ-like living out of the home because he realized that if he accomplishes this, he can impact the advancement of Christianity. Someone said that your family lives in a war zone. With every exploding shell, the house shakes. Your physical body may never feel the shell shocks, and the plaster on your walls may remain intact, but the impacts are present all around you. Beyond the doors of our households, a battle rages. And listen to this. The battle is about glory and who will receive it. The battle is about authority and who will exercise it. And we know about this battle. What do we call this great battle? The great controversy. And your children, our children, are right in the middle of this battle. Our homes, our families are right in the middle of this battle. And Satan knows it very well, and he designed such a strategy that he wants to go after the families first. He'll go after our children first. Because if he gets them at the young age, he'll win the battle. The truth, the gospel, will only last as long as one generation will last. If we don't pass our faith along to the next generation, what will happen with the truth? Will go extinct with the generation. So we have work to do. If Satan has a strategy, God gave us a strategy as well in His Word, how we can battle against Satan for our children. So I want you to open your Bibles in Deuteronomy 6, verses 4 to 9. You know this verse very well, this passage. So we're going to read Deuteronomy 6, 4 to 9. This is one of the most important passages in the Old Testament scriptures, and one of the most important passages to the nation of Israel. It says here, verse 4, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength." What does it say next in verse 6? "And these words which I command you today shall be" what? "In your heart. And next, you shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. You shall bind them as sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorpost of your house and on your gates." Such an important passage. In this passage, there are 4 principles that God gives us, and these 4 principles can help us to develop a strategy how we can battle for our children against Satan. Principle number 1. I want you to remember those principles. Write them down. Principle number 1 is principle of incarnation. We start right from the beginning. God says, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. And these words which I command you today shall be" where? In your heart. So the words have to be where first? In your heart as parents. You have to first love God before you show a loving example to the children. First, it's you being an example of what a loving person is like. You being an example of what a loving relationship with Jesus looks like. If you don't have it in your heart, if you don't love God first, how can you share with your children what you don't have? What is that called? Hypocrisy? And believe me, children are so good at spotting hypocrisy. They are amazing. They can see that you don't live what you're teaching. You can preach to them, but if they don't see on your example, they will never follow them. The truth must be incarnate in our life. That's why this is the principle of incarnation. Incarnate simply means in the flesh. It has to become a part of us first before we show it to our children. As parents, we pass on things to our children every day. Did you know that? The children are watching us every day. The question is not whether we are passing things or not. The question is what we are passing on to the children. Good or bad. And the children will learn both from the parents. And not just from the parents, but from the people in the church as well. From the adults in the church. There is a story told of a husband and wife, both who were doctors. One a doctor of theology, and the other one was doctor of medicine. Both doctors, and 2 doctors in the house. When their doorbell was rung and the maid answered the door, she would often, they would ask, "Can I please speak to the doctor?" And she would always answer. The maid gave an interesting reply. She said, "Do you want the one who preaches or the one who practices?" Which doctor you want? We are very good at preaching to our children. The question is, are we good at showing them an example? Are we good at practicing? And look, God did not start saying, teach it to the children. He started first with what? You must have it first before you teach it to the children. It's not going to help much if they don't see it in your life. So we must do some work in our own lives as well before we go and teach it to the children. When children grow up and become young adults, many parents are bewildered by what they call a generation gap. Have you heard this? We hear this in the church. Oh, the generational gap. There is a gap between generations. But I read an interesting book, and this author says, when we go to parenting blueprint in Deuteronomy 6 that we have here, we discovered that this gap is not a generation gap, but a relationship gap. I like that. It's not a generation gap, because we always say, oh, this younger generation. Come on, older people, we always say that. Oh, look at these young kids, what they're doing. This younger generation, what do they know? But how many times did you take the time, you took the time to establish a relationship and be a mentor to that young person? How many times did you do that? Before you say that these young kids don't do much, they're this and that. It's not a generation gap. I do believe, after reading all these books and looking into this, it is a relationship gap. There is a thing going on right now in high schools, in Christian high schools. It's called Young Life. Go home and Google it, Young Life. And the whole idea behind Young Life is the Christian kids come together, but they have an adult mentor. Every kid has an adult mentor. And their idea is that there is no generational gap. It's just all about a relationship. You establish a relationship. You show them an example of what loving God looks like. And then the children will follow your example. A relationship is a vital foundation of the inspired plan of the spiritual education and nurture of our children. So the first principle is principle of incarnation. We must have it first before we give it to our children. Number 2 principle is the principle of indoctrination. And we continue reading in verse 7, the first part. It says, you shall what? Teach them diligently to your children. In other words, God says, when you got it, when you have it, you do what? Teach it to your children. Share with your children. When you got it, then share it with the next generations. If the transmitting of faith is interrupted, the next generation would be lost, and all our efforts will be lost. Now, I talked about the Great Commission, Matthew 28. As important as it is to teach everyone the gospel, the more important thing is to teach it to our own children. Did you catch that? As important as it is to teach the gospel to all the nations and to everyone, we must first teach it to whom? To our own children. What benefit would be to you if you gain 1,000 people for Christ and lose your own children? I want that to sink in a little bit. What benefit? And I'm preaching to myself as well. Because honestly, a lot of times I'm running around trying to save someone else. And I've been asked this week, how are you doing with a large church, with your doctorate, and with your family? I said, I don't know. Because honestly, I don't. But it's a very sobering thought to think about. Our first great commission is with whom? Our own children. That's the greatest commission. Sometimes we're busy preaching to others and saving others, Or we forget that we have someone to be saved in our own home. In our attempt, somebody says, to fulfill the Great Commission, we become guilty of a great omission. I like that. In our attempt to fulfill the Great Commission, we're missing our own children. The word teach them diligently is also translated in some versions to impress. Impress upon your children these truths. The word impress literally means to brand, like you brand cattle. Have any cattle ranchers here? Have you branded cattle before? What happens when you brand it? It becomes a part of them, right? Now, also this word teach them diligently means to instruct the kids repeatedly, over and over again. Now let me ask you a question. All of you parents know how many times you should tell your kid about something before they remember it. 1,000 times, maybe 2,000. That's why I always tell Dominic, how many times have I told you before? 1,000, 1,000,000, hypothetically speaking. But we all know that children don't really remember things they should be remembering very easy, right? You have to repeat it to them. And that's what this word means in Hebrew. Repeatedly, over and over again, until they get it. Somebody says that you need to drill it in their mind. Parents need to be diligent because our godless culture is constantly fighting for our children. So why do we need to be so diligent and repeatedly talk to them? Because the enemy wants to get your children, and he has a strategy. So that's why you have to repeatedly tell the children about God. You cannot be half-hearted because the battle for their spiritual destiny never ends. You are to talk about God's love and faithfulness to Him endlessly. Even though sometimes you say, I've told you so many times, tell them again. And believe me, I'm preaching to myself as well. Tell them again, and again. Now I want you to look at one quote on the screen. This is really disturbing to me. I was in Florida for 2 weeks for my doctoral studies, and one of my colleagues presented this to us. He's a pastor in Florida, in Orlando, in the Forest Lake Church, Jeff Patterson. And this was very disturbing to me, and I will show it to you how hard the enemy is fighting for your children. Okay, this is how hard he's fighting. This is Nicholas Humphrey. In 1997, he's an emeritus professor of psychology in London School of Economics. And he had this speech addressed to a lot of people in 1997. And let's read it together. It's a little bit long, but I want you to get the point how hard the enemy is fighting. It says here, children, I'll argue, have a human right not to have their minds crippled by exposure to other people's bad ideas, no matter who these other people are. Parents, correspondingly, have no God-given license to enculturate their children in whatever ways they personally choose. No right to limit the horizon of their children's knowledge, to bring them up in an atmosphere of dogma and superstition, or to insist they follow the straight and narrow paths of their own faith. But wait, there's more. Next slide. In short, children have a right not to have their minds confused by nonsense. And we as a society have a duty to protect them from it, from the parents he's talking about, from the nonsense that the parents is teaching, their own faith. Listen to this. So, we should no more allow parents to teach their children to believe, for example, in the literal truth of the Bible or that planets rule their lives, than we should allow parents to knock their children's teeth out or lock them in a dungeon. He compares the teaching of the parents, the beliefs that they're transmitting on to them, as abuse, as though the same as knocking their teeth out or putting them in a dungeon. That's what this person is doing here. Next, let's continue on. If children have a right to be protected from false ideas, they have too a right to be aided by the truth. And we as a society have a duty to provide it. Therefore, we should feel as much obliged or obligated to pass on to our children the best scientific and philosophical understanding of the natural world, to teach, for example, the truths of evolution and cosmology, or the methods of rational analysis, as we already feel obligated to feed and shelter them. End quote. When I looked at this quote and when I saw it, I couldn't believe how hard the enemy is fighting. I knew that he's fighting hard, but I couldn't believe how hard he's fighting. If you want to find the whole speech, it's online. It's called What Shall We Tell the Children by Nicholas Humphrey. What shall we tell the children? So what is he doing here? Nicholas Humphrey is very clear in his statement. He says that passing faith to your children is abuse, but to pass on the teachings of evolution is an obligation. Listen, on one point, Nicholas Humphrey agrees with God. And you know what's that point? You need to indoctrinate children when they're young. They both understand you need to get them young. At least one point. But they say you need to put in their minds the truth. Of course, they see differently what truth is, all right? But they both agree on that point. We need to hardwire a child with truth, but and it is way harder to rewire an adult than to hardwire a child. We always spend money, time, and effort in evangelistic series to win an adult, and we don't do much of that to win our children. It's so much easier to hardwire them from the beginning than later try to rewire all that stuff and win an adult. It's much, much easier to do that. So why do we as a church do not understand that when all the other movements, everyone in the world understands this principle? We need to invest in our children, and we sometimes neglect them. Why don't we understand that? We must hardwire our children with the message of loving God with all their heart, their soul, and their strength. This is the message we need to give to our children. Let's move on. You guys are not watching your watches, right? We agreed about that, all right? So this is an important message that I want to get across to you. So principle number 3. So we had the principle of incarnation, principle of indoctrination. Now it's the principle of initiation. If you read Deuteronomy 6 and verse 7, the second part, after it says, you shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall do what? Talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. As you can see, the first step in teaching your children God's truth is to talk about those truths in every circumstance of life. This is what Moses is saying here through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. When you sit in the home, when you walk, whatever you do what? You talk about God's truth. How many do that? How many of you do that with your children? You know, sometimes I drive Dominic to school and he always has a lot of questions. And some mornings at, 8 o'clock, I don't feel like answering questions, but then I feel guilty. I feel very guilty. This is a teachable moment. Every moment in your life, as you walk with them, as you sit down, as you lie down, as you eat supper, as you eat breakfast, as you drive them to school, drive them from school, it's a teachable moment. That's why Moses says here, teach them at every time, in every circumstance of life. Take the opportunity. And it's the principle of initiation. What it happens here, this is the real life application of truth. As you are doing something, ask your child to do what? To do it with you. Initiate them in those things. Help them to start doing it with you. First, they need to see your example. Then you talk to them about that. But then you start doing what? Well, let's do it together. As we're doing things together, let's learn about God and about God's truth. This is the stage of initiation. What the passage is saying here is that as parents, as you are doing your everyday life activities, try to start involving your kids in those activities as well. And try to make those educational moments when they can learn about God. Let me give you one very important point here. A lot of parents think this way. Well, if I'm going to spend time with my child, I need to carve some extra time in my schedule. It is something extra on my schedule. How many of you think that way? I do think, well, if I'm to spend time with my child, it's something extra in my schedule. Moses doesn't just list out things that the Israelites needed to start squeezing into their schedule. Do you see this? He doesn't say, listen, these are another 7 things that you need to squeeze in your schedule to do it with your children. He doesn't say that. What Moses is saying, instead he lists their schedule, he lists things that they are already doing, and he says, just think differently about those things that you're doing and use those to impress the love of God in the lives of your kids. You don't have to come up with extra time. Use the things that you're doing, the schedules that you already have, to teach your children God's principles. That's the process of initiation. Let me give you the last principle. The last principle from Deuteronomy 6 is the principle of immersion. I want you to read with me verse 8 and 9. And it says here, you shall bind them as sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. The passage says that it is not enough to just talk about the truth. You can see here, first, you show an example. Then you talk about those things. Is it enough just to talk to the children about that? No. Then the passage says start initiating them. Do it together. But is that enough? No. Children are not going to remember those things. They have a tendency to forget. So here in the last step, we need to bind those truths on our children and then even write them as well. I was thinking about this. We know that this is a symbolic and metaphorical language, but we can also get some real life application from this. As we allow our children to practice the things we taught them in everyday life, they will gradually become immersed in the truth. That's the principle of immersion. As we bind this truth to our children, they become attached to them. When you bind something to something else, what happens? Those things become what? Inseparable, all right? When you talk to your children, they might not remember things, but you have to drill those things, you have to exercise with them, and you have to do it with them until it becomes a part of them, until they are immersed completely in that truth. I think that when God said to bind God's commands on the children, He wanted the Israelites to make sure that the children take them everywhere they go. Now, it's very important to see this transition. Up until now, the children were doing things together with whom? With their parents, right? And that's why he says, when you're doing this with them, talk about it. When you're doing this with them, talk about it. Now in this last stage, to me, I see a transition where the children are not with the parents anymore. It will happen at one point, right? Some of you are close to that stage and you don't know what to do, right? But it will happen. The kids will go away and they will leave and they will be on their own. That's why the truth needs to be bound to them, because what? It's inseparable. They will take it with them wherever they go. That's why you bind it on the children, because they cannot take it off. They will take it with them. A lot of parents say, well, I don't know what happened with my child. While they were home, they were such good kids. As soon as they left, they're completely different. Have you heard people saying that? I heard many, many times. That's why this truth needs to be bound to them. That when they leave, they take it with them. They need to take it with them. Otherwise, and this is the stage where the faith of the parents becomes the faith of the children. And let me tell you, that's very important. Because if my child leaves home and that faith that I was talking to him about is just my faith, It will never happen. He will leave the faith. It has to be immersed in his life so it becomes his faith. This is what happened to me when I was around 16, 17 years old. A lot of people say that, we are jealous of those people that didn't grow in Adventist church and had that conversion experience. You hear that, right? They have such marvelous conversion experience. And I'm a fourth generation of Adventists, and I'm like, I never had that amazing experience. I never can stand up front and tell that, wow, I was a drug addict and then I became a Christian, I cannot tell that because I did not go through that experience. But let me tell you, here Moses is talking about generational faith. It's a beautiful experience, amen? It is a beautiful experience, and I don't want you to ever doubt that you never went through that beautiful experience, because you have that experience when your parents give this to you and you continue on. It's a generational faith. And I had that experience and the point for me of conversion was this point, when my parents' faith became my personal faith. My parents' Adventism became my Adventism. All right? Because if I left home and saying, that's my father's religion, he's a pastor in the church, that's my mom's religion, it will never happen. It has to become internalized. You have to be completely immersed in that religion, and that's when it becomes your religion. In conclusion, I like the story of a little boy who was asked if he believed in God, and he answered, well, yes, of course I do believe in God. And when he was asked, why do you believe in God? He says, well, I guess it just runs in my family. Parents, I invite you and I encourage you today to make sure that your faith, the faith in true God, runs in your family. That you pass this faith on to the next generation. This is what this text is all about. The enemy is fighting hard for your children. The devil is waging a war against you, and he has a strategy how to fight that battle and to win it. But if we follow God's strategy, if we follow God's plan on passing on our faith to the next generation, devil will be defeated, and we will win our children for God. Let me read you this quote and I'll conclude with this. Dr. E.B. Meyer says, if Protestantism loses out, it will be because it has lost faith in the reality of child's religion and has not understood his need. It is painful to think how often we neglect the children and then labor with agonizing prayer and heroic appeal for the conversion of men and women. If the Christian faith loses out, it's because we neglected our children. So let me ask you that question from the beginning. The enemy has a plan for your children. Do we have a plan for them? May God bless you. Amen.